Welcome. Hello. All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. And so what I want to do is, great, Kennedy. I'm glad to hear that. I love to hear that you guys are still uh, communicating and observing even while at work. That makes me very proud. All right. And so let's see here. If I can have a moment to get the names down. All right. So we're covering test 2, right? Test 2 for History 102. And so we're covering overseas empire, the Spanish-American War, and geopolitics at that time, and so forth. We're covering the Progressive Era. We're covering Woodrow Wilson and World War I. And we have covered the Roaring Twenties. So that's what you have covering such topics on this test. All right. Let's see here, almost done. All right. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to share the screen. Now, please remember, I don't always, I don't go through the whole test like I do on test 1, but I still will offer opportunities at the end should you have a specific question on a specific question. All right. And so, yeah, let's see here. So getting right into it. Remember the different types of revisionist history. Remember, court history cannot deny that we took these places over. We got involved on these islands, etc. What they can do is try to defend us and trying to contend that we felt compelled, we felt pushed, almost coerced through 2 soft presidents, Cleveland and then eventually McKinley, to get sucked into this Spanish-American War, to get sucked into this geopolitical game, etc. Revisionists, you could find some of this in the textbook as well. You have gold bugs who contended that the only way to get out of the Depression was to find markets overseas to dump our surplus goods. That is true. Secretary of State Gresham saw symptoms of revolution and thought that maybe getting involved elsewhere would serve as a healthy distraction and unify Americans in a splendid little war. Lobbyists, different groups, right? Missionaries, big businesses had their own interest in getting involved in the Philippine Islands and elsewhere. And so they had their own separate agendas, and they lobbied Congress and lobbied the federal government and put pressure on them for that. Look at the last one. Emilio Aguinaldo of the Philippines and Jose Marti of Cuba. Did they unilaterally, just unreservedly want America's help? No. When you look at the primary sources, they were reticent, and for the right reasons. They were afraid that we were going to do pretty much what we ended up doing. And that was, after helping them out, refuse to leave their homes. Okay, and so that's the one that you're looking at that's not correct. The dangerous ideas are in number 1 of the handout. So you should be able to find them there. The military history. The U.S. achieved a quick victory via a well-organized army. First of all, it was rather quick, but not by an organized army of highly armed koala bears. Every now and then I'll throw in a silly option. The instructor subjectively claimed that U.S. naval technology was lopsidedly superior and that the Spanish hurt themselves in Cuba via strategies that seem ineffective in hindsight. Yes, absolutely. The instructor highlighted Puerto Rican and Filipino high morale in support of U.S. armed forces. I did not. The instructor stated that the participation of the African-American, the Buffalo Soldiers, was inconsequential to the outcome. I did not. I said the converse of that. So you know which one I was looking for there. McKinley was depicted as an enigma. You find that right out of the handout, subjectively by me, a puzzle of a man who seemed, there is evidence that you could use that suggests that paints a portrait of a very hesitant bully that was somewhat sucked into this war. But then his ultimatum to Spain, that he knew the ultimatum that Spain could not meet, knowing it would lead to war, then broadening the scope of the war to the Philippines and Puerto Rico, not just to help free Cuba. He was an enigma of a man. Let's see here. James G. Blaine, I did use him symbolically for that. The power of ideas held by men in important positions, and those dangerous ideas, like I said, are right out of number 1 of that assignment. An increasing willingness to engage in aggressive geopolitics, absolutely. And of the Marxist accusation of governments dangerously intertwining foreign policy with the interests of big business. And that goes in line with the writings of Walter Lefebvre. So absolutely. Taft's dollar diplomacy. Did he use brinkmanship, where he would threaten war in every case if the Latin American countries did not open up to American investment, etc.? No, he boasted just the opposite, that the influence of the almighty dollar was sufficient and the U.S. having its way with the Latin American countries, and that there was no need for formal empire, just informal one. Through economic hegemony, economic domination. All right, the Platt Amendment is right in the handout. Which of the following is false regarding Theodore Roosevelt? After a plebiscite in Puerto Rico, he gave the island its independence. Is Puerto Rico to this day independent? No, it's still an organized territory under the United States. All right. Number 11, the instructor subjectively depicted American imperialism in the Hawaiian Islands as a well-meaning progressive crusade by Haole. That's what they called out the white outsiders there, that had to overcome the opposition of Queen Liliuokalani's regressive, domestically unpopular, and tyrannical agenda. No. My historiography is in line with virtually every book I can get my hands on post 1990, and they are almost all revisionist history, whereby the American Haole are the bad guys and the native Polynesians are the victims. And I don't have time. I don't want to take the time on this one single question to do a long lecture on Hawaii, but just in a very short form, it started off with good intentions, according to the common narrative, by missionaries. Then their sons, the very next generation was not as interested in things spiritual and in converting the Polynesians to Christianity. They got involved in business. Look up Castle and Cook as a corporation that became a giant in the Hawaiian Islands in the sugar industry. And so you have something called the Bayonet Constitution. I want to say that was one of the Kamehamehas as the leader of the Hawaiian Islands, of the Polynesian people. And he was pretty much coerced into this republic. And it looked great on paper with checks and balances, federal republic like ours. but it had such steep requirements for citizenship, property requirements, that it ended up disenfranchising most of the poor Polynesian people. So they weren't even citizens on their own island. And so Queen Liliuokalani had had enough, and she tried to take it back. And yes, hers was a bit autocratic in getting rid of a Republican form of government, Republican on paper. And another part that made it just on paper was the power of the cabinet, the Haole-filled cabinet that kind of had its way in influencing and even bullying Kamehameha and the other leaders before Liliuokalani came to the throne. So she'd had enough. And so, but her constitution was on paper rather autocratic, putting herself as the queen. And so a guy named Lorne Thurston and other Haole businessmen met. Her chief of police began to arrest them, and they had already met with the administration of Benjamin Harrison and received Harrison's blessing that he would protect their lives, liberty, and property if something should go down in the Hawaiian Islands. So when this happened, American Marines showed up on the Hawaiian Island. The Polynesian people were ready to fight them. Liliuokalani gives a famous speech saying she doesn't want one drop of blood on her behalf for her leadership, that she'll diplomatically resolve it with the United States. And that didn't happen. And so the Haole were able to form a new republic, and she was stripped virtually of the throne. She became a figurehead, literally was under house arrest. And it didn't take long for us to annex this republic into the United States as a state. So it's a sad, sad story, almost according to any narrative I could get my hands on of the Hawaiian Islands. All right, the progressives, remember the image of them as do-gooders. They wanted to correct or ameliorate any perceived problems or injustices during the Gilded Age. And remember from your Gilded Age assignments, we had two of them. One dealt with economics, the robber barons, etc., the inequity of wealth, the wealth consolidation, the big robber barons gobbling up all their competitors, monopolies ensuing. The second one dealt with immigration and dealing with the immigrants. So the progressives were trying to deal with a bigger government involvement in resolving those perceived problems, right? In particular, they didn't want class war between the rich and the poor. They wanted to give hope and help to the marginalized and to the poor. And they wanted to hold the wealthy accountable. And in some cases, wanted some type of direct or indirect redistribution of wealth to take away the overwhelming power and influence of big business in particular, and replace it with a bigger, more robust government that gets more involved in the economy, and with the encouragement of the development of a larger middle class for the health, supposedly, of the economy and the health of the republic, so we don't have a revolution or a class war. And so court historians depict them as do-gooders, people who were comfortable from the old middle class, a lot of lawyers, judges, big university professors, writers, educated people, and that they didn't need to take the time or the resources to help the poor the way in which they did, but they did it in altruistic fashion and patriotic fashion. Revisionist, starting with like Richard Hofstadter in the 60s, began depicting them saying, well, I think that they were angst-filled, selfish people. I think that they were jealous of big business and envious of big business. I think, and resentfully so. And I think that they were scared of literally being caught in the middle of a class war as members of the middle class, the old middle class. And they wanted to give more power to themselves in having professionals and those who had the proper credentials controlling at least local, if not state and federal government positions. And so you always have an argument on every topic, a division in how they depict the key protagonists of that topic. So you have that with the progressives. Let's see here. So number 13, dealing with trust in big businesses, unfair advantages over smaller ones and over their employees. Absolutely. Combating that which they felt broke up nuclear families like alcohol and prostitution. Yes. Conserving natural resources and preserving state and national parks. That was part of their agenda. Enforcing strict laws and penalties concerning poor juvenile urban street crimes. No. They wanted to give opportunities to the poor, marginalized immigrants, etc. And in the whole argument of nature versus nurture, they were big adherents to the influence of nurture. And they wanted to simply change their environment and reform them rather than punish them. And so let's see here. Moving along. Number 16, the conservative argument was that progressivism goes against the founding fathers' notion of meritocracy. There's a number on that in the assignment. And because remember, they want to find a way to help reallocate the distribution of wealth and distribution of opportunities and give more to the have-nots, whether they have earned it or not. And so that's the conservative argument, is that it goes against meritocracy, that you should earn and work for everything that you get, and that you shouldn't punish big business for being successful, etc. They absolutely utilize new sciences like sociology to study and combat systemic cycles of poverty and marginalization. So the settlement houses, sometimes a criticism of them was that they were rather myopic and trying to impose WASP, old middle-class norms on immigrants, trying to make kind of mini-me's of them, and that they were not always, as you see in Chicago, not always empathetic and thoughtful regarding cultural differences. All right. And so that's a common critique of those institutions. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt became the first president to identify himself as a progressive. He did so as the governor of New York as well. Richard Hofstadter does claim that he embraced the progressive movement as a manly, chivalric knight's errand because he was born into wealth. And so that sense of noblesse oblige, the nobleman's obligation to help those who need help and to fight that good fight with him through bigger government and more government involvement. Absolutely. He took the father figure impartial role during labor strikes in the Pennsylvania coal strike, claiming he wasn't siding with the union laborers nor with the employers, but was wanting each to get his fair shake, right? His square deal, as he called it. Roosevelt's administration publicly attacked bad or misbehaving trusts. Absolutely. He told J.P. Morgan that it would have a cathartic effect on the public, that kind of publicly spanking the big trusts would make the general public feel better and relieve some of their anger and resentment toward them. He supported socialized medicine, transportation, and education. Was he a gas and water socialist? No, he wasn't that far to the left. All right, so that one's false. The administration of Taft, ironically, broke up more trusts than any of the three progressive era presidents, not Woodrow Wilson. And then we move into World War I. Remember the different isms. And so European imperialism, those who were being colonized, nationalism, secret contingency alliances, and the threat of Germany's ascension. Absolutely. America's refusal to evacuate the Samoan Islands, no, that did not cause World War I. That's not usually attributed as a cause. Technically, we went to war because of violations of our merchants' international rights on the high seas to trade non-contraband goods to whomever they please, even during war. And the German U-boat was violating that and taking lives, right? The submarines in international waters. Let's see here. Woodrow Wilson was a Whig, an Anglophile, according to Hofstadter, and that's what you have in your handout. So many of these, you guys, come right out of the handouts. His Committee on Public Information was not depicted as congruent with his rhetoric because it became a propaganda machine, and it became rather crude form of propaganda, which went against his notions of intellectual autonomy of the individual to think for himself. So that was one of many ironies of Wilson's administration. Carl Schenck, that was a curtailment, a cutting short of our First Amendment rights, not broadening and securing them. Remember, he told the people to not to join the draft, to evade it, and to rise up against the war machine that's trying to send them to their deaths in Europe. And he claimed that it was his First Amendment right to say such. And they contended that in this famous case, that if your expression creates an environment of clear and present danger for the Republic, then you cannot express such. So you can't yell to this day, bomb in a theater or on an airplane or anything like that, and that would arguably cause an environment of clear and present danger. Number 27 is true or false. A section in the handout suggests that circumstances beyond Wilson's control compelled him to violate his own rhetoric during World War I, and that is absolutely true. That is the sympathetic thesis to him in addressing how he practiced one thing while he preached another. So instead of calling him a hypocrite, instead of saying that power changed him or that he changed with age, they contend that he felt like he couldn't live up to what he had written as an intellectual at Princeton once he became president because of the situations. And you see that, I think it's number 4 in that handout. So go back to it and read it and see how that is argued if you'd like to. All right. The Doughboys fighting in World War I, their numbers mattered. That was the first thing I tried to convey. There was tension with the French because they were put under Ferdinand Foch and the French command. There was tension over that. There was tension between officers and foot soldiers, especially as the war digressed into a stalemate by the time the United States got involved and became so bloody in scope. And also because young men were getting officer positions just from college degrees that had nothing to do with military tactics and infantry fighting and so forth. All right. Black American soldiers often received a taste of better treatment when fighting with the French. Absolutely. Conservative progressive regulations against immorality and drunkenness stifled the soldiers' experience. The common narrative says that it did not. They were intended to do such, but that it didn't work, that it wasn't successful. and that the American boys, the doughboys, quote, lost their innocence in France and in Europe. The 14 points. They are involved in what Wilson called multilateral liberal enforcement. Later on, Bill Clinton will advocate this policy as well, is that, you know, like with the UN and NATO, that the world civilizations should unite and form a tribunal, form an army and police force, and have a set of international requirements based upon classical liberalism, based upon human rights, limited government, etc. And that when one dictator rises, when one country tries to gobble up a smaller country, that the rest of them gang up on the bully and enforce liberalism in that part of the world. Articles 10 and 231 went against the spirit of Wilson's message and plan for the post-World War world, absolutely. They did not follow the 14 points at Versailles. We were Johnny-come-latelys to the war. There was resentment in the sense of, Wilson, who do you think you are? We fought from 14 to 18, and you weren't here until 17. You're not going to dictate the terms. And let's see here. Although they did form a League of Nations, but we didn't join it. He didn't bring any Republican senators with him to Versailles, and the Republicans in the Senate stopped our signing of the Versailles Treaty. So we had to sign a separate peace treaty with the Germans and the Ottomans and the Habsburgs. And yeah, so there that went. So a lot of what Wilson dreamed about, what he wrote on paper, did not come into fruition. And many things he did just the opposite of. And remember, one of them, like I mentioned, was the War Industries Board. He said he was going to break up big business, and instead he enriched big business by giving these lucrative contracts for big business to build tanks and guns, etc., for the United States Armed Forces. All right. Wilson lived up to his rhetoric about self-determination and evacuated the Philippines. No, he didn't go that far, although he put them on a timeline to receive their independence, which does not happen until the end of World War II. All right. Ironically, Woodrow Wilson's administration did invade Mexico twice. A guy named Huerta formed a military coup against Francisco Madero, the provisional president, when Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, was chased out of Mexico. And there was a big rat race for power. So you had Carranza and Pancho Villa up in the north. You had Zapata down in the south, and Madero. And they're all vying on the battlefield. And Madero was trying to do it in a more sophisticated way by votes. And he wanted a federal republic. And he wanted things to be decided again by the vote. And so Woodrow Wilson was enamored with Madero, thought Madero was his man, that he was the most liberal of those contenders. And Huerta, the leader of Madero's army, turned against him, had him arrested. Wilson gave an ultimatum to Huerta to release Madero and to have free and fair elections and let the Mexican people decide upon their next leader. And Huerta had Madero executed instead. So he invaded Mexico. There was also a Tampico episode where our naval boys had to stop in Tampico for problems with their ship. And they were taken in custody and tortured and beaten and interrogated as to why they landed in Mexican territory. So it was also punitive for that Tampico incident. And the second incident was Pancho Villa. When Woodrow Wilson was giving aid to both Carranza and Pancho Villa, and at a crucial time, he didn't want to bet on a losing horse in his own estimation, Woodrow Wilson. And he felt like Carranza had much more in resources and had more of a political experience, etc., even though he was more conservative than Pancho Villa. And so he went with Carranza as far as arms and help. And Carranza defeated Pancho Villa in the battlefield. And Pancho Villa felt betrayed by Wilson. So he attacked Columbus, New Mexico. He tried to attack the military fort. And when the people came out of their homes with guns, he fired upon them. And they killed like 21 civilians in the town of Columbus, New Mexico. And then he crossed back across the border. And so Pershing was sent back across the border to chase after Pancho Villa to find him. And that constituted our second invasion of Mexican territory. Ironic from a president, right? That was all about self-determination for each country. So just a lot of ironies with Woodrow Wilson's administration. All right. And then that which traditionalists were fighting in the culture war of the 20s, which you just did, you see there. This probably isn't all inclusive, but it does include all of the following: rebellion against Victorian norms of sexuality and propriety, consumerism, hedonism or living for pleasure, embrace of secularism and Darwinian theory, and alcoholism and jazz culture. All of those were associated with non-WASP minorities and seen as a threat to the American traditional way of living, to conservatives, to traditionalists. So that is true. The new woman, everything was stated about her except for B. Most did not become economically independent. They didn't go that far. It wasn't that well economically for most women in the 20s. Prohibition, as it was depicted as having attained limited success, right? The 18th and 20th Amendments. The Harlem Renaissance, right? It was claimed in class that crossover events, and you see those crossover events here, and I mentioned those in my lecture in the video. The new Negro was identified in class with a lack of desire to integrate into WASP America, with a pride in Blackness, with Marxist goals and sometimes violent means sanctioned, yes. Harlem itself burgeoned into a multicultural, modern, cultural, avant-garde, socioeconomically white-collar city, no. Philip Payton and other African-American leaders tried to turn it into such, but it didn't succeed. Josephine Baker, in my lecture, I made her as an example of the limitations of the influence of the Harlem Renaissance, as she endured much discrimination. And of course, she fell in love with a man from France. Her business went very well, and her shows and her style and her reputation were very well embraced in France. But as a contrast, her treatment that she endured in the United States may have had something to do with her moving to France. All right. 36, Langston Hughes and Countess Colin's works on lives are depicted in class as indicative of an identity crisis, and I talked about that. Absolutely. Caught between desire for acceptance by white America and to heck with you guys, I'm proud of being Black. All right. The Scopes trial was about Darwinian theory of exospecies evolution. It's not just evolution, right? But evolving from one species into another, as opposed to endospecies evolution. Because I think endospecies evolution isn't really even contested. How humans have evolved and monkeys have evolved, etc. But a primate to a human, that's exospecies evolution. That's much more controversial. And that's what was being taught by John Scopes. And that's what he got fired for in that Tennessee high school in Dayton, Tennessee. All right. And I'm looking at 37. Oh, look at A. I was going to say they're all correct, but look at A. The instructor argued that it should have involved the legal issues of authority over curriculum and goals and limitations regarding academic liberty. And he demonstrated that that is what indeed was focused upon. No, instead, as you see, B, the atmosphere, according to the instructor, quickly became circus-like as arrivals brought antics, hyperbole, right, deliberate, strategic exaggeration, and drama to the Tennessee town. The ACLU attorney Clarence Darrow publicly questioned the veracity of the Bible and instigated a quasi-holy war amidst an educational trial. So A is the one that doesn't fit. All right, and then the last three, I don't ever go over textbook ones after test one. I'm hoping and assuming that you've received your textbook by now. But just take a look at them there. Alan Brinkley fails to include in his introduction From Crisis to Empire, an economic depression and domestic, social, and political problems as relevant to overseas imperialism. So see if he does or does not include that as context to the Spanish-American War, etc. Two primary aims of the progressives, according to Brinkley's introduction, were justice and order. It'll be easy to look in the intro and see if that's true. Alan Brinkley, in the New Era chapter on the 20s, attributes the 24 Immigration Act and its leniency to progressive acceptance of non-WASP minorities during the 20s. Is that true? So take a look at the immigration in the New Era chapter on the 20s, and you'll see the 24 Immigration Act. All right, so are there any specific questions? That's about as thoroughly as I go through tests 2 and 3. You having tasted my subjective way of writing the test already in test 1. And like I said, so much of these questions and the answers therein are found right in the argumentative assignments. Any questions at all? All right. Can I get a thumbs up? Have I helped at all? Do you feel a little better?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Ricky. Cody, thank you.
Hey, Professor.
Yes.
Will this Zoom be posted today?
It won't be posted until at least tonight.
Okay.
But I plan to do that tonight.
Okay.
I don't know if I've confessed it to you, but I am so lacking in technological savvy that I literally wait for my wife to come home in the evening and help me do it.
All good. I just want to make sure it's since I'm at work, I'm not able to exactly. I'm able to listen, but I'm not like able to look exactly what you're talking about. So to like see what you're talking about as
Sure.
soon as you can.
Sure, you've got it.
Thank you.
Especially for students like you, Kennedy, that are taking the time at work to still come to my Zoom meetings. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Every time I see someone, I've had someone literally in uniform hiding behind a rack and showed me himself for a moment. And it just did my heart well to know the extent to which some of you are sacrificing and going out of your way to come to these Zoom meetings. So that's the least I could do, Kennedy. As soon as my wife gets home, I'll do my best to have her help me put it up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so that's it, you guys. So just like any other assignment, you have until Sunday evening to submit this test, but please be deliberate, okay? No, and don't be, I want to say this in the right manner, but know that you only get a single submission now. And so historically, my test 2 scores are oftentimes the lowest scores that my students garner throughout the whole class. So don't be too hard on yourself if you miss a handful of them, but just do your best to keep an eye on those argumentative assignments. So much comes right out of them, or if it fell through the crack of the sentences, it should be found in my Zoom lectures. All right. All right, so that's it, you guys. Thank you. You guys have a great week. Good luck. I genuinely wish you well. I want to encourage you. I know you could do well. So go do it, okay? All right, so I'll see you later.